The galaxy had rules, and humanity was expected to follow every single one of them. Captain Marin Ashcroft stood on the bridge of the UEN frigate Steadfast, staring at a starfield that should have felt like freedom, but instead felt like a cage. The ship hummed beneath her boots as it drifted along the invisible boundary that the Galactic Concord had drawn around human space. She could see the marker buoys blinking in the dark, each one a quiet reminder that humanity was allowed to exist only within a box that someone else had built. She had served in the United Earth Navy for 22 years. She had fought pirates in the asteroid belts, escorted colony transports through unstable jump corridors, and once pulled a crippled mining ship out of a gas giant's gravity well with nothing but thruster burns and sheer stubbornness. But none of that mattered out here. Out here, she was the captain of a ship that the Concord classified as a minor patrol vessel of a Category 5 primitive species. The designation burned every time she read it. The Galactic Concord had existed for over 90,000 years. It was a coalition of more than 4,000 elder species that governed the Orion Arm with a grip that looked gentle from the outside, but crushed anything that pushed back. They had rules for everything: where younger species could travel, what technology they were allowed to develop, how fast they could expand, and how many ships they could build. Humanity had joined the Concord 2 centuries ago, not because it wanted to, but because the alternative was never clearly stated. The elder species simply arrived in Earth's orbit one day with a fleet of 10,000 warships, and said that membership was strongly recommended. Since then, humans had built colonies on a handful of worlds in a region the Concord called the Nursery Corridor. They paid developmental tariffs that stripped away nearly 40% of their raw material output. Concord standard technology packages that were reliable but deliberately limited. And they smiled and nodded in the forum of voices, while elder species debated whether humans were intelligent enough to be trusted with faster-than-light communication networks. Ambassador Idris Kita knew the smile and nod routine better than anyone. He had spent 15 years in the Concord's capital, a massive orbital station called the Nexus, navigating a political system designed to keep younger species grateful and obedient. He was tall, patient, and deeply intelligent, with a voice that could make even the most arrogant Concord diplomat pause and listen. But lately the patience was wearing thin. He sat in his office aboard the Nexus, reading the latest tariff adjustment report. A 23% increase on refined metals exported from human colonies. The justification was a single paragraph of bureaucratic language that essentially said, "Because we decided so." He set the report down and looked out the window at the vast station, spinning slowly against the stars. Thousands of species lived and worked here, and almost all of them accepted the Concord's authority without question. But Keita had done his research, quietly, carefully, over many years. He had found the gaps in the Concord's public records, the species that appeared in early census data but vanished from later ones, the civilizations that were mentioned in ancient trade logs but had no homeworld listed on any current map. He had counted over 400 such disappearances, spread across 90 millennia. The Concord called them developmental failures, species that had simply collapsed under the weight of their own inadequacy. Keita did not believe that for a moment. He believed the Concord pruned them, a quiet, clinical word for a quiet, clinical extinction. The Veltari Dominion was the oldest and most powerful of the Concord's 3 founding species. They were insectoid, towering creatures, with exoskeletons like polished obsidian and compound eyes that revealed nothing. Their society was built on pure utilitarian logic, every action measured against the cold mathematics of collective efficiency. They had maintained the Concord's stability for longer than most species had existed, and they did not tolerate variables they could not control. Archon Sithal was the Velthari's chief strategist, and he had been watching humanity for decades. He stood before the Concord's inner circle, A closed session, no younger species permitted, and presented his assessment with the calm precision of a surgeon describing where to cut. Humans, he explained, were a problem that was growing faster than projected. Their population growth exceeded Concord models by a factor of 3. Their technological innovation, even within the restricted packages, showed patterns of lateral thinking that no other species in the nursery corridors had ever displayed. They asked too many questions. They modified equipment they were told not to touch. They had an unsettling habit of looking at a rule and asking, why, instead of simply obeying. He recommended pruning, the standard procedure for species that posed a risk to galactic stability. The inner circle listened. The vote was held behind sealed doors. The result was 3,891 in favor, 12 against. Humanity's pruning was approved with the same bureaucratic efficiency as a tax adjustment. None of this reached human ears. Not yet. 3 weeks later, a Concord fleet arrived at Alara Colony, humanity's largest off-world settlement. 12 million people lived there, orbiting a gas giant in the Tau Ceti system. The fleet announced itself as a routine compliance inspection, a standard audit of colonial operations that happened every few years. Ambassador Keita received formal notification and passed it along to the colonial governor with a note that said everything was in order. Captain Ashcroft, patrolling 3 systems away, noted the fleet's arrival on her sensor display and thought nothing of it. Inspections were tedious but harmless. 600 warships from 7 elder species hung in orbit above Alara, their hulls gleaming in the light of a distant sun. At their center sat the Velthari dreadnought carrier, Silent Decree, a vessel so massive it cast a shadow across the colony's orbital stations. Below, 12 million humans went about their lives. Children walked to school. Workers boarded transit shuttles. A woman in a garden dome watered her plants and looked up at the sky, where the Concord ships drifted like a slow constellation. She did not know that she was already dead. None of them did. The galaxy whispered, and humanity could not yet hear what it was saying. But that silence, that vast, ancient, carefully maintained silence, was about to break in a way that no species, elder or otherwise, had ever imagined possible. There was no declaration of hostilities, no broadcast demanding surrender, no ultimatum delivered through diplomatic channels. The 600 warships of the Concord fleet simply opened fire at once, and the sky above Alara Colony turned white. The orbital stations died first. Massive rings of steel and glass that housed millions of people, shattered in seconds by concentrated plasma bombardment. The debris spread outward in expanding clouds, tumbling through the void, still glowing with the heat of the blasts that tore them apart. Emergency shelters activated across the colony's surface habitats, thick doors slamming shut as alarms screamed through every corridor. But the shelters had been designed to withstand meteor strikes and equipment failures, not the focused firepower of a galactic armada. The Velthari dreadnought Silent Decree hung at the center of the formation like a cathedral of black iron, directing the assault with mechanical precision. The operation from his command chamber, watching data streams that tracked every human structure, every power signature, every life sign. His officers worked without emotion, adjusting targeting solutions the way a gardener might adjust the angle of a blade before cutting a weed. The Velthari doctrine of pruning was absolute. It demanded totality, no survivors to carry the memory of what was lost, no records to inspire future resistance, no graves to become shrines. The species had to be not just killed, but erased, so thoroughly that the galaxy would forget it had ever existed. This was not cruelty in Scythal's eyes, it was maintenance. On the surface, the killing was methodical. The fleet worked in grids, section by section, burning through habitat domes and underground bunkers, with weapons designed to crack planetary crusts. Transport ships that tried to flee were tracked and destroyed before they could reach jump distance. A convoy of emergency shuttles, carrying 3,000 children from the colony school district, made it halfway to the system's edge before a Veltari interceptor wing caught them. The shuttles broke apart silently in the vacuum, scattering wreckage and small bodies across the dark. Captain Marin Ashcroft was 3 star systems away when the first distress signals reached the Steadfast. The communications officer's face went pale as the transmissions flooded in, dozens of them, then hundreds, overlapping and fragmenting, voices screaming over static, and the deep bass rumble of explosions. Ashcroft crossed the bridge in 2 strides and listened. The signals were chaotic, but the message was clear. Ilara was under full military assault by the Concord fleet that was supposed to be conducting a routine inspection. She ordered an immediate jump to Tau Ceti, full military burn, every system pushed to maximum. The crew moved without hesitation, but they all knew the math. 3 systems away meant hours of travel, even at maximum speed, and the transmissions were already growing weaker. They listened as they flew. They heard a dockworker calling for his wife on an open channel, his voice breaking as he described the fires spreading through the lower habitats. They heard a medical officer in a collapsed hospital trying to coordinate evacuations that had nowhere to go. They heard a teenager broadcasting from a rooftop, narrating what she could see, the ships above, the beams of light cutting down through the atmosphere, the silence that followed each impact as another section of the colony went dark. One by one, the voices stopped. On Earth, the feeds went live within minutes. Someone on Ilara had linked a visual relay to a deep space communication buoy before the Concorde fleet could destroy it. The footage was raw and shaking. Orbital stations breaking apart, surface domes cracking open like eggshells, the constant flash of weapons fire painting the clouds in shades of orange and red. Lasted 47 minutes before a Concorde warship found it and burned it out of existence. But 47 minutes was enough. 11 billion people on Earth watched their colony die. Governments issued statements that no one heard because the streets were already filling with people, not in protest, not in panic, but in a silence that was somehow louder than any scream. Cities around the world went quiet as crowds gathered in public squares and stared at screens showing the same footage on a loop. The destruction of 12 million lives played out again and again, while the world held its breath. And then the silence broke. Not into grief. That would come later. It broke into something far older and far more dangerous. A fury so deep and so universal that it crossed every border, every language, every political divide that had ever separated one group of humans from another. For the first time in the entire history of the species, there was no argument. There was only a single, unified understanding that something had been done that could never be undone, and that the ones who did it would answer for it. Ambassador Idris Keita was already in motion. He had been in his quarters aboard the Nexus when the reports reached him, and he moved through the station's corridors with a speed that startled the alien diplomats who saw him pass. He reached the Forum of Voices, the Concorde's Grand Assembly Chamber, a vast amphitheater where thousands of species debated policy under a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time map of the galaxy, and demanded an emergency session. He was denied. The session moderator, a creature from a species so old its name was just a mathematical symbol, informed him that no emergency sessions could be called for internal developmental matters. Keita asked what that meant. The moderator explained that the pruning of a Category 5 species was a standard administrative action and did not qualify for emergency. Keita forced his way to the speaking platform. The chamber fell quiet as he stood there, a single human, unarmed, surrounded by representatives of 4,000 species that had just voted to erase his kind. He spoke clearly, and without raising his voice. He described what was happening at Ilara. He named the number of dead. He asked the assembly to intervene. Archon Cathal rose from the Veltari delegation section and responded with a calm that bordered on boredom. He explained that humanity's pruning had been approved by a lawful vote of 3,891 to 12. It was legal under Concord statutes dating back tens of thousands of years. It was precedented. Hundreds of species had been pruned before humanity, and the galaxy was better for it. He said that most species were pruned before they ever left their homeworld, and that humanity should consider it a courtesy that they had been allowed to spread as far as they did before the correction was applied. Keita stood in silence for a long moment. He looked around the chamber, at the thousands of faces, some sympathetic, most indifferent, a few openly satisfied. He understood then, with a clarity that felt like a blade is sliding between his ribs, that diplomacy had never been an option. It had been a leash, and he had spent 15 years holding it willingly. Security officers approached to escort him from the platform. He turned to leave. Then he stopped and looked directly at Archon Cathal. His voice was quiet, but the chamber's acoustics carried every word to every seat. "You should have killed us all at once." He walked out without looking back. The last transmission from Alara Colony was received by a UEN communications relay 4 hours after the assault began. It was audio only, low quality, recorded on a personal device in a collapsed shelter somewhere beneath the surface. A woman's voice, later identified as Lena Okafor, a primary school teacher, was reading to a group of children. The shelter's oxygen supply was failing, and she knew it. The children probably knew it too. But she kept reading, her voice steady and warm, telling a story about a ship that sailed to the edge of the world, and found that the world had no edge at all. The recording lasted 11 minutes. Then there was silence. Above Tau Ceti, the Concord fleet completed its work and withdrew in formation, leaving behind a field of debris that stretched across Alara's orbit like a wound in the sky. The silent decree was the last to leave, its massive hull turning slowly away from the ruins. 12 million people were gone, and somewhere in the dark between the stars, Captain Ashcroft's frigate dropped out of its jump into the Tau Ceti system and found nothing but wreckage and silence. She stood on her bridge and stared at the remains of a world she had sworn to protect. She did not cry, she did not scream. She simply stood there, very still, and something behind her eyes changed in a way that would never change back. On Earth, the Fury was no longer silent. It had a voice now, and it spoke with 11 billion throats, and it said one thing that every human understood, regardless of where they were born, or what language they spoke, or what they had believed before that day. It said, "Never again," and it meant it. The day after the burning of Alara, every government on Earth ceased to exist. It was not a revolution. There were no speeches, no coups, no armies marching on Capitol buildings. The leaders of every nation on the planet simply walked into a single room and walked out as one body. They called it the United Earth Sovereignty. A global referendum was held within 72 hours, and 11.2 billion people were asked a single question. Do you authorize the full unification of Earth's governments, resources, and military under a single command with a single mandate? The vote came back at 97.6% in favor. The mandate was 3 words long: build, arm, return. Within a week, the UES issued its first and most important order: total communications blackout. Every colony, every outpost, every ship, every satellite, every deep space probe that carried a human signal went dark. The transmission stopped. The beacons went cold. The channels that the Concord surveillance networks monitored around the clock fell silent, as if someone had simply unplugged the entire species from the galaxy. The Concord noticed, of course. Intelligence reports were filed. Assessments were made. The general conclusion among the elder species was predictable. Humanity was collapsing inward, broken by grief, and the shock of the pruning. This was expected behavior. The Velthari had seen it before. A pruned species sometimes lingered for a generation or two, huddling around its homeworld, slowly fading as its population declined and its infrastructure crumbled. It was the natural end of the process. The body died after the spirit was broken. The Velthari had never been wrong about this before. They were wrong now. Behind the blackout, something extraordinary was happening. Something that would have terrified every elder species in the Concord if they had known about it. Humanity was not collapsing. It was not breathing, not in the way the Concord expected. Grief was there, buried deep in the bones of every human alive. But it had been compressed into something harder and denser, like carbon crushed into diamond. The species was not falling apart. It was being forged. The UES converted the entire global economy to a war footing within 6 months. Every factory, every shipyard, every research laboratory, every university, every mine was redirected toward a single purpose. Civilian production was cut to the minimum necessary for survival. Luxury goods vanished overnight. Entertainment industries were repurposed into propaganda and morale operations. Agricultural systems were optimized to feed a population that was working around the clock. And the work was extraordinary. For 2 centuries, humanity had been forced to use Concord standard technology packages, reliable, efficient, and deliberately limited. The elder species had designed them that way on purpose. They gave younger species enough technology to function, but never enough to threaten them. Established order. It was like giving someone a bicycle and telling them it was the fastest vehicle ever built. Humanity had always suspected the bicycle was not the fastest vehicle ever built. Now, they proved it. Teams of engineers and scientists tore apart every piece of Concord technology they had access to, and laid the components bare. They studied the underlying principles, mapped the design philosophies, and found what they had always suspected. The technology was not just limited, it was actively hobbled. There were components that did nothing except restrict performance. Efficiency caps built into power systems, software locks that prevented optimization beyond a certain threshold. The elder species had handed humanity a machine with the brakes permanently engaged. The brakes came off. Human engineers did not just remove the restrictions. They rebuilt the technology from the ground up, combining Concord principles with human engineering approaches that the bicycle did not. Elder species had never considered because their own technological evolution had stopped advancing millennia ago. The Concord science had calcified, frozen in place by a civilization that believed it had already discovered everything worth discovering. Humanity's science was wild and reckless and willing to fail 1,000 times to succeed once. The results were terrifying. Quantum lattice shipyards were constructed inside hollowed-out asteroids, hidden from any sensor sweep the Concord might attempt. These shipyards could produce a fully armed warship in 11 days, a process that took the Concord's finest facilities 3 months. New weapons systems were developed that merged Concord energy projection technology with human concepts of redundancy and brute force. The elder species built elegant weapons that were precise and efficient. Humanity built weapons that were loud and ugly and hit like a falling mountain. Then there was Project Prometheus. Research facility buried beneath the ice of Europa. A team of 300 physicists worked on something that the Concord had banned 60,000 years ago: stellar ignition warheads. These were devices capable of triggering a cascading fusion reaction in the outer layers of a star, essentially turning a sun into a bomb. The Concord had not banned them because they were impractical. They had banned them because they worked too well, because a single warhead could threaten an entire star system, and because no species should have that kind of power. Humanity built 200 of them. The warheads were stored in armored vaults, scattered across a dozen hidden facilities, each one capable of ending a solar system. Each one a reminder of what humanity was willing to build when the alternative was extinction. And above it all, the fleet took shape. They called it the Ghost Fleet. 4,000 warships, assembled in secret across dozens of hidden shipyards. Were not beautiful, they were not elegant or sleek or designed to inspire awe. They were built the way humanity built everything when survival was on the line. Over-engineered, heavily armored, packed with redundant systems, and bristling with more weapons than any sane naval architect would approve. Each ship was a statement of intent, and the statement was simple: we are coming, and we are bringing everything we have. Admiral Marin Ashcroft commanded the fleet. She had been promoted 6 times in 5 years, not through politics or bureaucracy, but through the simple fact that no one else could do what she did. She had taken the rage and grief of Alara and turned it into discipline, structure, and purpose. She had not slept more than 3 hours a night since the burning, and the crew of every ship in the fleet knew it. They followed her not because she ordered them to, but because she carried the same weight they all carried, and she refused to set it down. Ambassador Idris Kita had returned to Earth after his expulsion from the Nexus. He had taken a position as the UES's chief strategist, and his knowledge of the Concorde's internal politics became humanity's most valuable intelligence asset. He mapped the relationships between the elder species, identified the fault lines in their coalition, and found the weakness that would bring it all down. The Concorde, he explained, was not an empire. It was a protection racket, held together by fear and mutual self-interest. The elder species cooperated because the cost of cooperation was lower than the cost of defiance. But if someone were to dramatically increase the cost of cooperation, if the Concorde's military infrastructure were suddenly gone, if its communication networks were severed, if its most powerful member were publicly humiliated, the coalition would shatter like glass. Each species would retreat to protect its own interests, and the unified front that had maintained galactic order for 90,000 years would cease to exist. It was a plan built on one terrifying gamble: that humanity could hit hard enough, fast enough, and precisely enough to break the machine before the machine could respond. 5 years after the burning of Alara, the Ghost Fleet was complete. Admiral Ashcroft stood on the bridge of the UES flagship Alara's Memory, a dreadnought 3 kilometers long, with a hull of layered reactive armor and a weapons array that could crack a moon. The ship had been named by unanimous vote of the fleet's crews, and every sailor aboard understood what the name meant. They carried the dead with them, and the dead would not be forgotten. Behind the Alara's Memory, 4,000 warships stretched across the dark, in formations that blotted out the stars. They were silent, running on minimal power, waiting. Ashcroft looked at the tactical display one last time. She thought of the schoolteacher on Alara, reading to children in a collapsing shelter. Of the dock worker calling for his wife. She thought of the teenager on the rooftop, narrating the end of her world for anyone who might be listening. She opened a channel to the entire fleet. Her voice was calm and steady and carried the weight of 5 years of preparation and 12 million ghosts. 5 years ago, they taught us what the galaxy really is. Tonight, we teach them what we are. The Ghost Fleet powered up its engines, and the stars behind them disappeared behind a wall of blue-white drive light. Humanity was coming home to a galaxy that had forgotten to be afraid of them. The Ghost Fleet emerged from its blackout simultaneously across 40 star systems. 4,000 warships appeared on Concorde sensor networks at the same instant, like a hand reaching out of the dark and wrapping its fingers around the throat of a civilization that had believed itself untouchable for 90,000 years. Alarm signals cascaded through every Concorde military installation, every Elder Species command center, every diplomatic station across the Orion Arm. The sensor operators who first detected the signatures did not believe their own instruments. 4,000 ships from a species that had been classified as pruned, as broken, as dead, appearing everywhere at once with energy signatures that matched nothing in any known database. Panic does not begin to describe what happened next. 1 hour after emergence, Ambassador Idris Keita's voice reached every communication frequency in the galaxy. He broadcast in every Concord language simultaneously. That should have been impossible, given the Concord's own encryption protocols. But human intelligence operatives had spent 5 years cracking those protocols, and the elder species had never thought to change them, because no prune species had ever survived long enough to use them. Keita's message was calm and precise and utterly without mercy. To the Concord of Voices, you named us primitive, you called our pruning mercy. 12 million of our people, our children, burned at Ilara, while you voted it lawful. We do not recognize your law. We do not accept your mercy. We are coming, and we will not stop until the cost of what you did is paid in full. This is not a war. This is a reckoning. The message played on repeat for 6 hours. Every species in the galaxy heard it. Every species understood it. And for the first time in living memory, the elder species felt something they had not felt in millennia. Fear. Admiral Ashcroft began the campaign at hour 3. Fleet did not attack civilian populations. It did not descend on homeworlds with weapons blazing. It did not burn cities, or poison atmospheres, or do any of the things the Concord had done at Ilara. This was a deliberate choice, and Ashcroft had made it over the objections of officers who wanted blood. She understood something that rage alone could not teach, that the way you fight defines what you become, and humanity would not become the thing it was fighting against. Instead, the fleet targeted the infrastructure of Empire, the systems and structures that allowed the Concord to function as a unified force. Every major Concord military shipyard was hit within the first 6 hours. Coordinated strike groups dropped out of jump space at precisely calculated positions, and unleashed weapons that the elder species had never seen before. Human-designed plasma accelerators punched through orbital defense platforms that had been considered invulnerable for 10,000 years. Shipyards, massive orbital constructions where the Concord's warships were built and maintained, broke apart under concentrated fire that lasted minutes, not hours. The speed was the message. Humanity had not come to fight a long war. It had come to end an empire in a single stroke. Strategic fuel reserves were next. Every elder species maintained vast stockpiles of refined antimatter and exotic fuels at hidden locations across their territories. Human intelligence had mapped every single one of them over the past 5 years, using sensor technologies that the Concord did not know existed. The reserves were destroyed in a wave of simultaneous strikes that left the elder species fleets stranded without the fuel to mount a coordinated response. Then the communication relays. The Concord's FTL communication network was the nervous system of its power, a web of relay stations that allowed instantaneous coordination across thousands of light years. Human strike teams hit every major relay with precision. Relay node in a cascading sequence that was designed to look random, but was in fact precisely calculated to create maximum confusion. Each relay that went dark cut off another sector of the Concord from the rest, fragmenting a unified command structure into isolated pockets that could not talk to each other, could not coordinate, could not respond as one. By hour 12, the Concord's military infrastructure was in ruins. Its shipyards were debris. Its fuel was gone. Its communications were shattered. And the Ghost Fleet had not fired a single shot at a civilian target. The Battle of Velthar Prime began at hour 14. The Velthari homeworld was the seat of the species that had ordered humanity's pruning, the heart of the oldest and most powerful civilization in the Concord. Its orbital defense grid was the most formidable military installation in the galaxy. 700 weapons platforms, 200 warships in permanent garrison, layered shield generators that could, theoretically, withstand the combined firepower of every other species in the Concord. Admiral Ashcroft brought 1,500 ships, and the will of a species that had spent 5 years preparing for this single moment. The battle lasted 9 hours. It was the largest naval engagement in galactic history, and it was fought with a ferocity that the Velthari had never encountered. Their defense grid was a masterwork of military engineering, and it extracted a terrible price. 340 human ships were destroyed, their crews lost in the fires of combat that lit up the space around Velthar Prime like a second sun. But the humans did not stop. They did not slow down. They did not retreat. They absorbed the losses and kept coming, wave after wave, punching through defense layers with weapons that should not have existed, exploiting gaps with a tactical creativity that the Velthari's rigid command structure could not match. The defense platforms fell, one by one. Garrison fleet was broken into fragments and hunted down. The shield generators overloaded and collapsed. By hour 23, the Ghost Fleet held orbit above the Velthari throne world. Ashcroft did not fire. She did not glass the planet. She did not even aim a weapon at the surface. Instead, she opened a direct communication channel to Archon Sithal, and did something far worse than bombardment. She forced him to watch. The transmission from the Steadfast's archives played on every screen in Sithal's command center. 47 minutes of footage from Alara colony. Every burning habitat, every shattered station, every child's face visible through the window of a doomed evacuation shuttle. Every second of the schoolteacher reading to children as the oxygen ran out. Ashcroft made Sithal watch all of it, while his throne world sat defenseless beneath human guns. When the footage ended, she asked him one question. Her voice was flat and hard, and carried no emotion at all. Was it merciful? Sithal did not answer. The channel remained open for 2 full minutes in silence. Then Ashcroft gave an order. A single stellar ignition warhead was launched, not at the Velthari sun, but into empty space at a carefully calculated distance from the system. The warhead detonated, and for 6 hours, the sky above Velthar Prime turned white as the controlled fusion reaction blazed like a temporary star. The entire planet was bathed in light so bright that the Velthari could not see their own moons. The message required no translation. We could end your sun. We could burn your world the way you burned ours. We have the weapon, and we have the will, and your defenses are gone. We chose not to. Remember that choice. By hour 30, the Concord began to die, not from military defeat, from politics. Keda had predicted this with the precision of a surgeon. The Concord was a coalition, not a nation, and coalitions survive only as long as the members believe the cost of staying is lower than the cost of leaving. The Ghost Fleet's campaign had destroyed the military infrastructure that enforced unity. The communication blackout had isolated every species from every other species, and the demonstration at Velthar Prime had shown that even the most powerful member of the Concord could be humbled. Younger species moved first. Dozens of civilizations that had lived under the Concord's boot for millennia began broadcasting open support for humanity. Some of them were species that had narrowly avoided pruning themselves, saved only by their willingness to submit completely to Concord authority. They had been silent for thousands of years. Now they spoke, and their words were like cracks spreading through a dam. 3 elder species formally withdrew from the Concord within hours. 7 more declared neutrality, a diplomatic word for abandonment. The coalition that had governed the galaxy for 90,000 years was bleeding members, like a wounded animal, bleeding heat into the cold. At hour 48, humanity delivered its terms, not to the Concord, because the Concord was already dying, but to every species in the galaxy. The demands were not what anyone expected. Humanity did not ask for territory. It did not demand tribute, or submission, or the destruction of the elder species. It demanded something far more radical: dissolution. The Concord must cease to exist entirely. Not reformed, not restructured, but ended. Every pruning record must be unsealed, and broadcast to every species in the galaxy. Every civilization that had been erased must be named, documented, and memorialized. The elder species responsible for prunings must face a tribunal, not a human tribunal, but one composed of representatives from the species they had victimized. At hour 72, the Concord's remaining leadership accepted. They had no military left to fight with, no communication network to coordinate through, no coalition to draw strength from. The machine that had run the galaxy for 90 millennia was broken, and the species that broke it was the one they had dismissed as primitive. Admiral Ashcroft received the formal acceptance on the bridge of the Alara's memory. She read it once, set it down, and stared at the stars for a long time. 340 ships lost, 9,000 human sailors dead. The cost was real, and she felt every single one. But for the first time in 5 years, the weight on her shoulders shifted. Not lighter, but different. The fury was still there, would always be there. But now there was something else underneath it. Something that might, in time, become peace. The galaxy was silent, but it was a new kind of silence. Not the enforced quiet of species too afraid to speak, but the stunned quiet of a civilization that had just watched everything it knew get turned upside down in 72 hours by a species that had been written off as dead. And in that silence, something new was beginning to grow. The Concord was gone, not just defeated, not just weakened, but dissolved entirely, its institutions dismantled, its authority revoked, its name already becoming something that species spoke in the past tense, with a mixture of relief and disbelief. In its place, a new structure was taking shape, fragile and uncertain, and loud in a way the galaxy had not been for 90,000 years. They called it the Open Assembly. Ambassador Idris Kita had spent months drafting its founding principles, working alongside representatives of hundreds of species, many of whom had never been allowed to speak in the Concord's forum of voices. The principles were simple in a way that made the elder species uncomfortable. No pruning, ever, under any circumstances. No developmental restrictions on younger species. No hierarchy of civilizations based on age or technological advancement. Every species had one voice, and every voice carried equal weight. The Assembly's first sessions were chaos. Hundreds of species that had been silenced for millennia suddenly had a platform, and they used it. Arguments broke out over everything: trade routes, territorial boundaries, reparations, resource sharing, and 1,000 other disputes that the Concord had simply crushed into submission. There were walkouts and shouting matches, and moments when it seemed like the whole experiment would collapse before it even began. Keita watched it all with something that was not quite a smile, but was close. He had spent 15 years in the Concord's forum, watching alien diplomats debate in perfect order, while atrocities were committed behind closed doors. He would take the chaos. A galaxy that argued openly was healthier than one that obeyed in silence. But beneath the noise of the assembly, a quieter and more solemn process was underway. The Tribunal of Names had begun. When human intelligence operatives had broken into the Concord's sealed archives during the 5 years of preparation, they had found something that staggered even the most hardened analysts. Complete records of every pruning conducted over 90,000 years, documented with the meticulous precision of a bureaucracy that kept records the way other species kept trophies. 412 civilizations erased from existence, their homeworlds sterilized, their histories deleted from every public database, their names removed from every star chart, every encyclopedia, every record that might have told the galaxy they had ever lived. The Tribunal's task was to give those names back. It was held in the Open Assembly's central chamber, a vast space that had been built in orbit above a neutral world specifically for this purpose. Representatives of every known species attended, filling the chamber in numbers that dwarfed even the old Forum of Voices. The proceedings were broadcast on every frequency to every corner of the galaxy. One by one, The names were read. Human archivist stood at the center of the chamber and spoke each name aloud, followed by whatever information the sealed records contained. The species' homeworld, their approximate population at the time of pruning, the date, and the elder species responsible. Some entries were detailed, with physical descriptions and fragments of cultural data. Others were almost empty, just a name and a date, the only surviving proof that an entire civilization had once existed, and then been deliberately destroyed. After each name, there was silence. The chamber fell quiet, and for a moment, 400 billion beings across the galaxy held that silence together. Mourning species they had never met, grieving for histories they would never know, acknowledging a crime so vast that language could not contain it. It took 11 days to read all 412 names. By the end, delegates who had entered the chamber as strangers left it as something else. But something harder to name. A community of witnesses, bound together by the shared knowledge of what had been done in the name of order, and what it had cost. Archon Scythal stood trial on the 9th day. He was brought before the tribunal in restraints that were largely ceremonial. The Veltari's military power was broken, their fleet scattered, their empire reduced to their homeworld and a handful of loyal colonies. He stood in the center of the chamber, towering above the human judges and alien witnesses, his compound eyes reflecting the light of 1,000 screens, displaying the names of the species he had helped to erase. He did not deny anything. He did not apologize. He did not beg for mercy or claim that he had been following orders. His testimony was delivered in the same calm, precise tone he had used when he recommended humanity's pruning years ago. "We maintained order," he said. "For 90,000 years, the galaxy was stable. Species rose and fell. The structure endured. Wars were prevented. Chaos was contained. The prunings were not acts of hatred. They were acts of maintenance, no different from cutting dead branches from a tree so that the tree itself might survive. You have removed the gardener. Now the garden will grow wild, and in 1,000 years you will understand why we did what we did." Cato was called as a witness. He sat across from the creature that had ordered the deaths of 12 million of his people, and spoke without raising his voice. "Perhaps you are right," he said. "Perhaps in 1,000 years this galaxy will look back and wish for the order you provided. But those 12 million people on Alara will not be alive in 1,000 years to see it. The children who died in evacuation shuttles will not debate the merits of your gardening. The teacher who read to her students as the air ran out will not weigh the cost of stability against the cost of freedom. That is the difference between us. Systems and acceptable losses. We see people, and we do not accept their loss." Scythal was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that no one expected. "You could have destroyed us. You had the weapon. You had the cause. You had the fury of your entire species behind you. Why did you not do it?" Cato looked at him with an expression that held grief and anger and something else, something that might have been pity. "Because then we would have been you." The chamber was silent for a very long time. Admiral Marin Ashcroft resigned her commission 3 months after the reprisal. She did it quietly, without ceremony, submitting her resignation to the UES Naval Command, and walking away from the fleet she had built and the war she had won. She gave no interviews. She made no public statements. She simply took off her uniform, packed a single bag, and boarded a civilian transport. The UES flagship, Alara's Memory, was decommissioned the same week, was towed to a stable orbit around the ruins of Alara Colony, the debris field that still drifted in the space where 12 million people had lived, and converted into a memorial museum. Its weapons were removed. Its armor was left scarred and unpainted, still bearing the marks of the Battle of Velthar Prime. Inside, its corridors were filled with the names of every person who had died at Alara, etched into the walls, in letters small enough that a visitor would have to lean close to read them, an act of intimacy, forcing each mourner to acknowledge each name not as a number, but as a person. Ashcroft visited the museum once. She went alone, without telling anyone. She walked the corridors for 4 hours, reading names, stopping sometimes to touch the wall. She paused longest at a section near the ship's old bridge, where the names of the children from the school district were listed. 3,000 names, arranged alphabetically, each one a life that had barely begun. Without speaking to anyone, she was not seen in public again for a long time. The galaxy settled into its new shape slowly and unevenly. The open assembly stumbled and recovered and stumbled again. Some species thrived under the new freedom. Others struggled without the structure the Concord had provided. Old rivalries that the Concord had suppressed resurfaced, and new conflicts emerged that required negotiation and compromise instead of authoritarian decree. It was messy and difficult and imperfect, but it was alive. The silence that had defined the galaxy for 90,000 years was gone. In its place was something noisier and more complicated, the sound of thousands of species talking to each other without a filter, arguing and cooperating and failing and trying again. It was the sound of a galaxy that was no longer afraid to speak. And underneath it all, there was a deeper silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of memory. The names read at the tribunal. The faces on the walls of the Ilara's memory. The story of a species that had been pushed to the edge of extinction, and had come back, not with blind vengeance, but with a fury tempered by a choice that no one had expected them to make. Decades later, a Veltari historian named Thyra Set began compiling what would become the definitive account of the Reprisal. She traveled to hundreds of worlds and interviewed thousands of individuals from dozens of species. She asked each one the same question at the end of every interview. What did you learn about humans? The answers varied. Some praised humanity's courage. Others criticized their recklessness. Some feared what they might do next. Others simply expressed surprise that a species so young had accomplished what 90 millennia of elder civilizations had not. But one answer stood above the rest. It came from a delegate of a species called the Renari, a quiet, gentle people who had nearly been pruned themselves 4,000 years ago, and had survived only by surrendering everything that made them unique. The Renari delegate sat in a garden on her homeworld, surrounded by flowers that her ancestors had been forbidden to grow, and spoke carefully. We learned that humans do not forget. They do not forgive easily, but they will choose mercy even when mercy is the harder path, even when every reason in the universe tells them to choose destruction. That is what makes them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Not their weapons, not their rage, their restraint. Because a species that can destroy you and chooses not to, that is a species you can never predict, never control, and never dismiss. And that is more frightening than any fleet. Thyra Set recorded the words and moved on. She spent another year gathering testimonies, compiling data, and writing her account. When it was nearly finished, she sat alone in her study, aboard a research vessel orbiting a quiet star. At the galaxy, vast, noisy, chaotic, alive, and thought about the species from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star that had been told to kneel and had refused. She opened her manuscript to the final page and wrote a single annotation in the margin, a personal note that she never intended to publish, but that would eventually become the most quoted line in galactic literature. Perhaps the humans were never primitive at all. Perhaps we simply did not understand what we were looking at. She set down her pen and listened to the stars.